Between 371 and 368 BCE, Epiphanes of Thebes established a city in the center of the Peloponnesian Peninsula. He called this place Megalopolis, or Large City. A little over 2,300 years later, in the early 1950s, the geographer Jean Gottman became fascinated with the 600-mile belt of densely settled, heavily developed land between Greater Boston and Greater Washington, D.C. The post-war urbanization of the American Eastern Seaboard, he explained, had essentially transformed the region into a single giant city. He named it Megalopolis. This paper, Past, Present, and Future in the American Megalopolis, discusses academic intrigue around the urbanization of the U.S. Eastern Seaboard in the 1950s and early 1960s. It was during these decades that American social scientists began, quote, discovering megacities, both at home and abroad. Like Gottman, other scholars became fixated on the region Americans know now as the Northeast Corridor. And though they differed in what they called it, the Atlantic Urban Region, Boswash, Urban Region Number 1, or Megalopolis, they agreed that the region was unique. Gottman, for one, argued that there was only one megalopolis. Megalopolis was not a concept or a category or a phenomenon. It was a place. Moreover, it was the cradle of American civilization, mid-century America's economic, political, and cultural center, and a forecast for future American development. Megalopolis was a site for excavation and experimentation, a place teeming with both historical significance and untapped potential. My paper probes social scientists' investment in Megalopolis as a place representing America's past, present, and future. Moreover, it introduces the profusion of research on the urbanized Eastern Seaboard that not only influenced American policy at the local, state, and federal level, but also informed and was informed by paradigms of civilization, modernization, and development. In early 1952, Jean Gottman met colleagues from Princeton University's Institute for Advanced Study for lunch. Gottman got to talking about a project that was still in its early stages, a study of the regional urbanization of the American Northeast. This section of the country, as he explained it, functioned as the hinge of the American economy. When it was the national interest, the region could open the door to international migration or trade. But the hinge could also slam the door shut, turning to the domestic interior as labor source, trading partner, or investment site. Perhaps not unsurprisingly, Gottman's lunchtime companions struggled with this metaphor. It was clunky and, as they explained, difficult to visualize. In other words, economic hinge neither excited nor elucidated. Robert Oppenheimer, the Institute's director and the famous physicist, said to Gottman, "What you're talking about is really a megapolis." But this didn't sit well with the other men around the table, whom, as it happens, were classicists. Megapolis, they protested, was not correct Greek. It would have to be Megalopolis or Megalopolis. And so, to help Gottman pick the best name, and to grant his project for public consumption, they formed a committee. Gottman and his cadre of classicists, a group that included, among others, Harold Chernis, Homer Thompson, and Benjamin Merritt, explored a number of options, but they ultimately returned to Megalopolis. Megalopolis seemed fitting for two reasons. First, they recognized striking parallels between the historical Megalopolis, in Gottman's words, an ambitious little Greek town dreaming of greatness, and the emergent polynuclear city in the American Northeast. The Greek megalopolis had been intended to be both crossroads and capital within a system of city-states. It was, as Gottman described it, a sort of Washington. Second, the ancient Greeks, most notably Philo of Alexandria, had used the word metaphorically to describe order in the universe. The cosmos, the realm of rational law, which also conditioned the shape and structure of the real cities of men, might itself be seen as a city of ideas. The American megalopolis was a crossroads and a capital for an urbanizing world. A world in which the regional city seemed poised to overtake the nation as the dominant organizing unit, geographically, politically, economically, and demographically in human affairs. Culturally, Megalopolis was the cradle of American civilization, as well as a domestic and international civilizing force. This was not to suggest that city-states would outright replace nation-states, but that one would be remiss not to recognize regions as important entities in their own right. Gottman stressed that Megalopolis be understood as a place and not a classification. That's not to say, however, that Megalopolis was divorced from an increasingly salient global phenomenon of urbanization and metropolitan convergence. Megalopolis was an only child, but it had many cousins. In the 1950s, Gottman himself had identified 10 relations of Megalopolis. One stretched 200 miles across central England from the conurbation made up of Liverpool, Manchester, Newcastle, and Birmingham, southeast to Greater London. Another was the 250-mile strip from Amsterdam to Paris, along continental Europe's northwestern seaboard. A third ran from Paris to Le Havre, about 100 miles, along the valley of the River Seine. There was also a cousin in the greater Ruhr area, anchored by industrial centers in western Germany and the eastern corners of Belgium and the Netherlands. A fifth hugged the northern border of Switzerland, connecting Zurich, Basel, and Geneva. A sixth in northern Italy was the constellation of Turin, Milan, Venice, and Genoa. A seventh in Russia ran 270 miles up the Volga River from around Moscow towards Leningrad. An eighth in Japan was the 25-mile belt between Tokyo and Yokohama. A ninth in Brazil was the 150-mile expanse between Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo. And finally, a 10th was the greater Buenos Aires region in Argentina. Megalopolis was unique but not unrivaled. It was exceptional but not odd. But why study it? Certainly, Megalopolis was interesting, but why was it important? Megalopolis, for want of a better phrase, was a time warp. An analysis of this region's problems, Gottman wrote, often gives one the feeling of looking at the dawn of a new stage in human civilization. Indeed, the area may be considered the cradle of a new order in the organization of inhabited space. Megalopolis might be, in his words, a laboratory in vivo. It was a space to observe the, quote, normalcies of tomorrow, and a testing ground for creative experiments in societal science. Gottman's fascination with Megalopolis was shaped by both personal experience and his unique professional situation. Gottman was, almost all his life, a peripatetic and an outsider. He was born into a well-to-do Jewish family in Ukraine in 1915. He fled the Soviet Union in the care of his aunt and uncle as a small child. He lived in Paris from age 5 to 25, when, once again, he was forced to flee, this time from the Nazis. Gottman ended up in the United States, and through professional connections at academic and academic-adjacent institutions, assembled a collection of appointments and assignments that compelled him to travel between Boston, New York, Princeton, Baltimore, and Washington, D.C. on a regular basis. As Gottman commuted up and down the East Coast, he was struck by what he observed as near continuous development between Boston and D.C. Moreover, Gottman's experience shaped his understanding of this place as one in which government, academic institutions, research foundations, and business, arenas in which he had either worked or consulted, were not only concentrated, but also one where these networks were interdependent, overlapping, and mutually reliant. The Northeast, in this conceptualization, almost resembled a city in both form and function. Gottman perceived American society as characteristically urban, or rather urbanizing, institutionally connected, demographically itinerant, and increasingly service-oriented. His impression of the present colored his reading of the past and his ideas about the future. One of the primary factors in Megalopolis' historical ascendance, American ascendance, was, he believed, the organization and orientation of its cities. Cities which grew through competition and collaboration with one another were society's engines. To understand how cities worked was to understand how civilization itself advanced. Cities were a propulsive force, but in the early 1950s, it was clear to Gottman that the city itself was changing. It was critical then to study this emerging urban form. It wasn't the developmental paradigm that needed retooling or redefinition, but its cardinal unit, the category underpinning it all, the city. Gottman wasn't alone in noticing or publicly commenting on the urbanization of the American East Coast. In 1955, Carlton F. Shute, the then associate director of a private, nonprofit New York consulting firm, the Institute for Public Administration, wrote a two-part piece for the National Municipal Review, defining and describing urban regions in the United States. Shute called attention to the approximately 400-mile strip of urbanized land between Springfield, Massachusetts, and the southern tip of Fairfax County, Virginia, and he gave it the name Urban Region Number 1. In 1958, in the midst of John Gottman's study of Megalopolis, Christopher Tennard, landscape architect and city planning professor at Yale, contributed an article to Harper's Magazine called America's Super Cities. In a statement revealing that he was unaware of Gottman's appellation Megalopolis, Tennard commented that there was a, quote, great American city to which no one has given a name. This nameless city ran from Bangor, Maine to Norfolk, Virginia, and contained, quote, half the economic power of the entire world, end quote, and nearly a quarter of the American population. This sprawling city, he wrote, is the Atlantic urban region. The Atlantic urban region, which Tennard and Yale's city planning program had been studying at this point for the last 5 years, was one of 15 superregions in the United States. Other superregions, quote, discovered by Tennard's team included the Steel Belt, Pittsburgh, Youngstown, Canton, Akron, Cleveland, and the cities growing around Detroit, the Chicago-Milwaukee area, connecting Chicago and Detroit, the Los Angeles-San Diego Strip, and in Florida, the emerging linear city between Palm Beach and Miami. Shute, too, had identified urban regions in the United States, including one anchored by Seattle-Tacoma. Like Gottman, Shute and Tennard stressed that today's metropolitan problems could not be addressed as long as old conceptualizations of urban space prevailed. Shute claimed that the, quote, historic concept of metropolitan area as a core city surrounded by suburbs was too small a concept to deal satisfactorily with so large a problem. Tennard said, boldly, that city planning was, quote, obsolete. Regional planning, specifically urban regional planning, was the only way forward. What kind of reaction did Gottman, Tennard, or Shute hope to provoke by publicizing their research on regional urbanization in the United States? To whom were they writing? What sort of policy considerations or political actions did they hope to induce? First, all three wanted to see improvements in regional transportation. In building new roads, it was important to recognize that people drove across, around, and between metropolitan areas for work, errands, and recreation. Moreover, it was important that the urbanized East Coast consider installing a system of high-speed rail. Second, all three pushed for conserving open space. And finally, all stressed the importance of intra-regional cooperation and advocated for the creation of regional planning agencies. For these men, regional urbanization presented a challenge, but not an obstacle. Ultimately, their enthusiasm for this sort of development comes back to their faith in urbanization as developmental, civilizing, and modernizing. The urbanization of the American population and countryside was, therefore, not something to be feared, but rather to be expected. Urbanization was something to control and monitor, but not curtail. As Shute said, we must restrain ourselves from trying to draw a boundary, like an ancient city wall, around a dynamic phenomenon whose central characteristic is growth. End quote. The defining feature of cities was not the architecture, the size, content, or distribution of the population, or even the range of industry or employment. It was growth. Urbanization was not only a beacon of progress, but a progressive impulse